In December of 1348, the city of Cairo was burying the dead at a rate that the historian al-Makrisi, who witnessed it, recorded as something like 7,000 people a day. 7,000 every day for weeks. Some accounts suggest the true number was higher, but even the conservative figure overwhelmed the city entirely. The traditional funeral litters, all 1,400 of them, ran out. Bodies were carried through the streets on shop doors, on wooden planks, piled in communal boxes that workers refused to touch. The markets of the greatest city on earth, a metropolis that dwarfed London and Paris combined, fell silent. At the same moment, in the Syrian city of Damascus, chronicles record thousands dying every day, the deaths so numerous that bodies were stacked in the Umayyad mosque itself. In the port of Tunis, a 17-year-old scholar named Ibn Khaldun was watching his parents, his teachers, and the intellectual world he had been raised in vanish within weeks. In the mountains of central China, 6 out of 10 people in entire provinces were dead. The bubonic plague did not spare the Islamic world. It did not spare North Africa. It did not spare Asia. It struck the entire connected world of the 14th century with comparable ferocity. Mortality varied by region, by season, by density, by luck. But the scale of the blow was civilizational everywhere it landed. So here is the question most documentaries leave in the shadows. If the plague hit Cairo and London equally, if it killed the same share of people in Tunis and in Paris, if it devastated China and Egypt and England all at once, then why do we tell its story as if it only happened in Europe? And more importantly, if the same disease struck the same blow everywhere, why did it produce completely different outcomes? Europe got the Renaissance, the printing press, the Reformation, and the high-wage economy. Egypt got 2 centuries of agricultural collapse. China got a revolution that closed its borders to the world. People often say the Black Death created the modern world, but that is not quite true. It did something stranger. It revealed which worlds were already built to survive what came next, and which ones were not. The question is not what the plague did to the world. The question is why the same plague did completely different things to completely different worlds. The answer has nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with culture, nothing to do with which civilization was more advanced. It has everything to do with something far more mundane and far more unsettling. It has to do with who owned the land and whether it rained. The story begins not in Europe, but in the mountains of Central Asia, in a place most history books have never mentioned. In 2022, paleogenomicists analyzing skeletal remains from Nestorian Christian cemeteries at a site called Kyrgyzstan near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan made one of the most significant historical discoveries of the decade. The tombstones, carved in Syriac script, recorded a catastrophic mortality event in the years 1338 and 1339, with the cause explicitly inscribed as pestilence. The DNA extracted from these graves contained the direct ancestral strain of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. This was ground zero. The ecology of the Tian Shan Mountains, populated by wild marmots, had harbored the pathogen for centuries. But in the early 14th century, the climate shifted, a cooling, drying transition that destroyed the mountain grasslands. Marmot populations, starved of vegetation, migrated toward agricultural settlements. Their fleas jumped to domestic rats. Their rats jumped to merchant caravans. And those merchant caravans were connected by the most efficient communication system in human history to the entire known world. The Mongol Empire had built the Yam, a high-speed postal relay system that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea. What moved along it normally was silk, spices, and correspondence. What moved along it in 1338 was a bacterium with a 3 to 7 day incubation period and an untreated mortality rate of up to 80%. This is the fact that should stop you cold before anything else in this story. The Black Death was not a local disaster that spread slowly outward. It was the first truly global crisis in human history, and it was global for the same reason a modern pandemic is global, because the world had become connected. The Mongol Empire had done to the 14th century what container shipping and air travel did to the 21st. It had made the world one place. And when you make the world one place, you also make disease one disease. If you watched COVID spread across a connected world in 2020 and wondered how something could move so fast, the answer is the same answer that explains 1348. The infrastructure of connection is also the infrastructure of contagion. By 1346, it had reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, where Mongol forces were besieging a Genoese trading colony. The chronicles record that the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, the first documented act of biological warfare in history. Modern epidemiologists doubt the catapults were the real mechanism. Dry corpses don't carry active fleas. The real transmission was quieter and more inexorable. Genoese merchant vessels slipping out of the harbour at night, their bilges full of grain and their grain full of rats. By October 1347, those ships had docked in Messina, Constantinople, and Venice. The world was about to change, but not in the same way everywhere. What happened next has been told 1,000 times, but always from one direction. Let me tell it from 3. In Cairo, the historian Ahmad al-Makrizi documented what he saw with the precision of a man who could not believe his own notes. The city's water carriers, the thousands of men who hauled water to households daily, vanished overnight. The price of a single goat skin of water rose from a fraction of a coin to 8 dirhams. Wheat could not be ground because the millers were dead. Shrouds became the only currency that moved. Al-Makrizi describes a Mamluk warrior, fully armed, riding through the abandoned suburban fields of Cairo, attempting to cut the unharvested clover himself with his sword, and stopping, exhausted and defeated, unable to do the work that the dead peasants had done. In Damascus, something different happened. The Syrian chroniclers record that at the height of the outbreak, as thousands died every day, the entire population of the city, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, came together. They fasted for 3 days. They assembled in the great Umayyad mosque, carrying their different holy books. And they walked barefoot through the streets together, praying collectively to whatever God they believed in. In Tunis, in the library of the Zaytuna Mosque complex, one of the greatest centers of Islamic learning in the medieval world, a 17-year-old student sat with his parents' bodies. Ibn Khaldun had lost his father, his mother, and every teacher who had shaped his intellectual world within weeks. He would spend the next 30 years thinking about what he had witnessed. The result would be the Muqaddimah, the first systematic work of sociology and historical philosophy in human history. He wrote, "Civilization both in the East and the West was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It was as if the voice of existence in the world had called out for oblivion." Ibn Khaldun was not European. His intellectual revolution was born in Tunis, not Florence. History gave Europe the Renaissance. It gave Tunis Ibn Khaldun. The West simply forgot to notice. The Islamic world's institutional response to the plague was, in several measurable ways, more sophisticated than Europe's initial reaction. Islamic legal scholars drew on prophetic traditions to build a coherent public health framework. Believers were forbidden from entering a plague-stricken land and forbidden from fleeing one, an early form of regional quarantine that limited geographic spread. Disease was understood as the will of God rather than the poisoning of wells by Jews, a theological stance that prevented the horrific pogroms that swept through the Holy Roman Empire, where 900 Jews were burned alive in Strasbourg alone. And those who died of plague were promised the spiritual status of martyrs. Some Muslim accounts remembered Medina as almost untouched by the pandemic. The theological explanation was diversity, a hadith stating that neither plague nor the false Messiah could enter the sacred city. The practical explanation, where restrictions were enforced, was far more earthly. Control the roads, control the caravans, control the disease. Theology and administration working in the same direction. And yet, despite the theological sophistication, despite the social cohesion, despite the quarantine systems, one great Islamic civilization emerged from the plague in permanent decline. Not because its religion failed it. Egypt's decline was the product of multiple interacting forces. The scale of mortality, the structure of Mamluk institutions, punishing taxation, climate fluctuations, and shifting trade routes, all pressing on the same wound simultaneously. But of all these pressures, one made the data uniquely hard to escape: its victories system. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Every schoolchild in the United States learns this sentence. But what it actually means, in practical terms, is that Egypt's entire agricultural system depended on a vast artificial network of dikes, canals, and flood control basins that had to be maintained, repaired, and dredged every single year by a massive coordinated labor force. This was not optional. Miss one summer's dredging and the canals silted up. Miss two and the dikes weakened. Miss three and the fields either drowned in uncontrolled flooding or dried to desert. Now remove 40% of the labor force in a single year. The Mamluk Sultanate that ruled Egypt was a military aristocracy of slave soldiers who lived almost exclusively in the citadel of Cairo. Their agricultural estates, assigned by the Sultan as non-hereditary revenue grants called ikta, were managed by absentee bureaucrats whose sole function was extraction. The Mamluk warrior had no long-term relationship with his land. He would never pass it to his children. He had no incentive to invest in its infrastructure. When the plague killed the peasants, he did not raise wages to attract surviving workers. He sent his bureaucrats to squeeze whoever remained, driving them to flee to the capital. And without the peasants, nobody dredged the canals. The Nile's summer floods, unchecked by the collapsed dike system, washed away the irrigation networks that had sustained Egyptian agriculture for 4,000 years. The historian Stuart Borsch, in the most rigorous modern analysis of Egyptian agricultural records, estimated declines of more than half in agricultural output across affected regions, figures that varied significantly by area. Not a brief interruption, a long structural decline from which Egypt's medieval agricultural system never fully recovered. Compounding this was the Waqf system, Islamic charitable endowments that Mamluk elites used to legally protect their estates from confiscation. By the 15th century, a vast portion of Egypt's arable land was locked inside these rigid endowments, legally barred from being sold, consolidated, or adapted to new labor conditions. In the Cairo Geniza, an archive of over 400,000 documents preserved in a Cairo synagogue for 7 centuries, we find the human face of this collapse. A deathbed will, written by a wealthy Jewish woman named Sit al-Dalal, who freed her domestic slave Muna in gratitude for nursing her through the epidemic. In England, the same plague produced a different document, a peasant negotiating a wage increase with a desperate landlord who had no one else to hire. The difference between those two documents is not that one civilization was wiser or more virtuous than the other. It is that one civilization's agriculture required massive, coordinated labor to function, and the others did not. When you remove half the labor force from a rain-fed economy, the survivors gain leverage. When you remove half the labor force from a hydraulic economy, the infrastructure collapses and takes everyone down with it. The same plague, different ground. England in 1348 was not a sophisticated civilization by the standards of Cairo or Tunis. It was a cold, damp island at the edge of the known world. But it had one structural advantage it had done nothing to earn. It rained. English agriculture was rain-fed. It did not require coordinated mass labor to maintain hydraulic infrastructure. When the plague killed half the labor force, the infrastructure did not collapse, because the infrastructure was weather. What collapsed instead was the power of the landlords. For the first time in centuries, the people who remained had leverage. Lords who refused to raise wages found their fields unharvested. Peasants who had been legally bound to the land simply walked away and found a better offer. The English government panicked. Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It failed completely. By the 1370s, real wages had begun their historic climb. By 1476, they had reached the highest level in English history and would not be surpassed for 3 centuries. What do you do when labour is expensive and you still need to harvest grain? You build a better tool. The short-handled sickle, which required a worker to bend down repeatedly to cut stalks, was replaced by the long-handled scythe, which let a single standing worker reap 2 acres a day. In a world where skilled labour had become expensive and scarce, labour-saving technologies suddenly made economic sense in a way they never had before. The calculation had changed. If a scribe now costs 10 times what he cost before the plague, the investment required to build a machine that replaces him becomes rational. Johannes Gutenberg's movable-type printing press, developed around 1450, was one such technology. Born from an environment where the economics of knowledge production had been permanently rewritten by demographic collapse. A Bible that cost the annual wage of a labourer in 1455 cost a single day's wage by the 18th century. Literacy became democratic. Ideas spread faster than institutions could suppress them. The Church, which had lost 45% of its clergy to the plague, struggled to replace them with educated men. It lowered its standards. It sold indulgences to rebuild its finances. In 1362, the English Parliament made the English language, the language of peasants, the official language of the law courts. A generation later, the Bible was being translated into English. A century and a half later, Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door in Wittenberg. None of this was planned. None of it was the expression of any European genius. It was the logical consequence of rain-fed agriculture and expensive labor colliding with a bacterium from Central Asia. In China, the plague arrived in waves that the dynastic annals recorded with numbing precision. The first wave, from 1331 to 1334, killed what Yuan dynastic chronicles record as 13 million people in Hebei and Hunan alone. The third wave, from 1353 to 1354, is recorded as killing 6 to 8 out of every 10 people in parts of Shaanxi and Hubei. Figures that, even if exaggerated by chroniclers, point to a catastrophe of civilizational scale. The ruling Mongol Yuan Dynasty, a foreign military aristocracy governing a resentful Han Chinese population, responded the way Egypt's Mamluks had responded, with extraction. When the Yellow River flooded catastrophically, the Yuan state conscripted hundreds of thousands of starving peasants to repair the dikes, not as paid workers, but as forced laborers. In Chinese political cosmology, this was a fatal mistake. Natural disasters were not random events. They were signs that the ruling dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven due to its moral failures. The plague, the floods, the famine, together they constituted a cosmic verdict. A syncretic Buddhist movement called the White Lotus began preaching the imminent arrival of a savior who would sweep away the foreign Mongol rulers. In 1351, the moment the Yuan state began its forced dike conscription, the White Lotus catalyzed the Red Turban Rebellion. Peasants wrapped red cloth around their heads and began a 17-year war against the Mongol garrisons. In 1368, a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, the son of a peasant who had survived the plague, the floods, and the famine, captured the capital and declared the Ming dynasty. The new Ming state turned inward. It restricted movement, reasserted control over trade, and rebuilt China around agrarian order rather than trans-Eurasian openness. The plague had given Europe the printing press. It gave China a wall. And here is the comparison that ties this entire story together. In China, the answer to civilizational chaos was centralization. One emperor, one decision, one closed door. In Europe, because there was no door, because 1,000 competing kingdoms could never agree on anything, the only available response was adaptation. Ming centralization produced closure. European fragmentation produced competition. This is the same argument as the Chinese Navy, written across an entire continent. The very thing that made China powerful enough to close itself was the thing that made closure possible. The very thing that made Europe too fragmented to close itself was the thing that forced it to innovate. Strength and weakness in history are rarely what they appear. There is one more consequence of the Black Death that no documentary has ever shown you. It is inside you. In 2022, researchers analyzing ancient DNA from 14th century plague victims and survivors in London and Denmark identified 4 immune genes that underwent intense positive selection during the pandemic. The most prominent was ERAP2, a gene that produces proteins responsible for identifying and destroying bacterial invaders. Individuals carrying 2 copies of the high-activity ERAP2 variant were 40 to 50% more likely to survive infection with Yersinia pestis. Their macrophages cleared the bacteria faster. They lived. They had children. Their children had children. Today, if you carry the protective ERAP2 variant, the one that saved your ancestors, you are significantly more likely to develop Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, or rheumatoid arthritis. Your immune system, trained by 7 centuries of ancestral memory to destroy a 14th century bacterium, sometimes turns on your own body instead. The plague is not only history. For some descendants of the populations it scarred, it is biology. A medieval bacterium helped shape immune systems that are still paying the price. We tend to tell the story of the Black Death as a story about death, about the third of Europe that vanished, the streets full of bodies, the collapse of the medieval world. But the more honest story is a story about what the survivors inherited and what kind of world their particular survival made possible. In England, they inherited leverage. In Egypt, they inherited collapsed canals. In China, they inherited a revolution. In Tunis, they inherited a grief-stricken 17-year-old who would think harder about why civilizations fall than anyone before or since. The Black Death did not create the modern world. It revealed the skeleton of every civilization it touched. In some places, that skeleton was built to adapt to what came next. In others, it was not. The difference was not faith, it was not intelligence, it was not destiny. It was the relationship between a civilization and its land, a relationship built over centuries, long before the first flea ever bit the first marmot in the cold mountains of Kyrgyzstan. The plague just showed us what was already there. Same plague, different ground, different institutions, different futures. That is not a metaphor, it is a mechanism, and it is still running.